Imagine, if you will, building a sprawling 100-acre city of dreams.
Right.
A place that physically birthed Luke Skywalker, the Xenomorph and the X-Men.
Absolute iconic properties.
Right. Now imagine a larger predator coming along, buying that historic city for $71.3 billion, and then almost immediately selling it for scrap metal.
Just to feed a digital streaming algorithm.
Exactly. Welcome to this investigative deep dive on Peak to Dust. Today, we are not looking at some Hollywood fairy tale. We are conducting a deeply analytical autopsy on the architecture of corporate power.
The anatomy of its collapse.
Yes, and the total erasure of 20th century Fox.
The entertainment industry is a landscape that is literally littered with the bones of dead empires.
Yeah, it really is.
But even in a sector that's entirely defined by volatility, few falls are as spectacular as total or, frankly, as ruthlessly executed as this one.
It's stunning when you look at the raw data.
It is. We are looking at the systematic dismantling of an institution that didn't just, participate in global culture. It actively dictated it for the better part of a century.
Right, and our objective today is to map out that rise, the absolute market dominance, and the ultimate dissolution of this corporate titan.
Exactly.
We are going to treat this studio not just as a dream factory, but as an aggressive corporate predator that conquered the globe, only to eventually be devoured by an even larger apex predator.
Which is the reality of the business.
It is. And just a quick note for you listening out there. Mapping this history means we inevitably intersect with some highly polarizing entities.
We have to.
Right. We are talking about the actions of Rupert Murdoch, Fox News, and the Fox Corporation. So, our mission today is strictly structural and financial.
We are impartially reporting the historical facts.
Drawn strictly from our source material. We take no sides, we aren't endorsing any political viewpoints, and we are simply following the money.
The corporate strategy.
Yeah, and the ruthless mathematics of how a media empire was built and ultimately dismantled.
Because the mechanics of the business, the flow of capital, and the strategic maneuvers that dictated the fate of this empire, that is what actually matters here.
Absolutely.
But, to understand the sheer magnitude of the collapse, you first have to measure the dizzying height of the peak.
Right.
And that requires looking at the foundational ambition of William Fox.
Let's examine that foundation. Because William Fox is a man who started in 1904 with just a single Nickelodeon in New York City.
Right. And for those unfamiliar with the landscape of early 20th century entertainment, a Nickelodeon was essentially this rudimentary makeshift theater.
Right, where patrons paid 5 cents to watch a series of short, silent films.
Exactly. It was a volume business. And Fox realized very early on that the demand for the product was massively outstripping the supply.
He just couldn't get enough films to keep his seats filled.
Yeah. So by 1913, he formed the box office attraction company to handle distribution.
But that still wasn't enough control for him, was it?
No, not at all. By 1915, he establishes the Fox Film Corporation. And here's where he makes a really critical strategic decision.
He moves his primary operations out west to Los Angeles.
Yes. And that relocation was essential. It wasn't just about finding a glamorous backdrop. It was a highly calculated operational maneuver.
How so?
Well, early film stock required immense amounts of natural light, right? And the cameras were incredibly cumbersome. They were difficult to operate in the harsh, unpredictable winters of the East Coast.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right, so moving to Los Angeles allowed for year-round production in a temperate, sun-drenched climate. That represented a massive logistical advantage.
Because you could shoot continuously.
Exactly, which meant you could generate product continuously.
And Fox took that advantage and scaled it incredibly aggressively. By 1928, his ambition had materialized into absolute physical dominance. He purchased 100 acres of land at Century Park in West Los Angeles.
A massive acquisition.
Huge. He didn't just build a studio. He built a self-sustaining industrial complex. He was aggressively vertically integrating his empire.
Right, attempting to control not just the physical production of the films, but their distribution networks and the physical exhibition spaces where audiences actually paid to see them.
Vertical integration was really the ultimate weapon of the early studio system.
Oh, without a doubt. If you own the cameras, the sound stages, the distribution trucks, and the theaters themselves, you eliminate the middleman at every single friction point.
You're keeping all the profit.
Exactly. William Fox was building an economic fortress. But, and this is crucial, the speed of that expansion created severe vulnerabilities.
Which brings us to a fatal level of early hubris. because William Fox really suffered from chronic overreaching.
He did.
He had this belief that aggressive expansion could just outrun any economic reality, and the most glaring example of this is his 1929 attempt to execute a massive hostile takeover of Lowe's Inc.
Right, and Lowe's was the parent company of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, or MGM, which was Fox's massive rival.
So this wasn't a merger of equals.
No, not at all. This was an attempt to swallow his biggest competitor whole.
And a hostile takeover of that magnitude required staggering leverage. I mean, Fox did not have the liquid capital to simply buy Lowe's.
He had to borrow heavily.
Right, he took on astronomical amounts of debt to finance the acquisition.
And at the exact same time, he was pouring capital into upgrading his massive theater operations and investing heavily in unproven new technologies.
Right.
He left his corporation dangerously overextended with incredibly thin margins for error.
And then that margin for error just completely evaporated.
It did.
In 1929, this catastrophic convergence of events struck the empire. First, William Fox suffered a near-fatal car accident.
Which left him physically incapacitated during a highly critical period of corporate maneuvering.
Exactly. And while he was recovering, the federal government launched an antitrust investigation threatening to sue over the Lowe's acquisition because they argued it would create an illegal monopoly.
And then came the final fatal blow.
The stock market crash in October 1929, triggering the Great Depression.
The credit markets froze entirely. That immense debt Fox had taken on to finance the MGM takeover suddenly became incredibly toxic.
Right, and his creditors, realizing the vulnerability of the corporation and the physical weakness of its founder, they moved in aggressively.
They absolutely did. Fox was systematically outmaneuvered by the very bankers who had financed his expansion. By 1930, he was ousted from his own company.
Just completely pushed out.
Yeah. The architect of the empire was gone, leaving the corporation heavily indebted, right as global consumer spending plummeted.
So the company that bore his name was suddenly rudderless during the worst economic crisis in American history. It limped along under a series of executives like Harley Clark and Sidney Kent, but the bleeding was severe.
Very severe.
By 1933, Fox West Coast Theaters, which was the company's vital exhibition arm and its primary source of cash flow, went into receivership. Let's pause and break down what receivership actually means in this context, because it wasn't just a restructuring, was it? It was a surrender of control.
It was a total loss of autonomy. When a corporate entity goes into receivership, a court-appointed receiver takes control of the assets to protect the creditors.
So management is out of the picture.
Exactly. The management no longer dictates the strategy the court and the banks do. The primary mechanism for generating revenue, which were the theaters, was fundamentally broken.
Right.
Fox Film Corporation was bleeding capital, they lacked leadership, and they were facing imminent collapse. They desperately needed a lifeline just to survive the decade.
And they found that lifeline in a highly pivotal May 1935 merger. Sidney Kent engineered a union with a company called 20th Century Pictures.
Right.
Now, 20th Century Pictures was this upstart independent production company. It had only been formed in 1933, but it was run by two incredibly formidable figures.
Joseph M. Schenck and the legendary Darrell F. Zanuck. And this was a merger born of absolute mutual necessity. It was a perfect, albeit desperate, marriage of complementary assets.
How so?
Well, Fox Film Corporation had the massive infrastructure. They had the sprawling 100-acre studio lot, they had the sound stages, and crucially, they had a global distribution network.
But they lacked leadership.
Exactly. What they completely lacked was creative leadership, disciplined production management, and star power.
And 20th Century Pictures was the exact inverse of that.
We're correct. Schenck and Zanuck had proven profitability. They had Zanuck's sheer operational genius and a really strong roster of marketable talent.
Right.
But as an independent company, they lacked the distribution pipeline to truly scale their profits. They were paying hefty fees to other studios to distribute their films.
So the merger basically solved both problems simultaneously.
It did. And in the resulting entity, 20th Century Fox, Darrell F. Zanuck assumed the role of vice president in charge of production.
And his compensation reflects just how desperate Fox was for his leadership. He was paid $5,000 per week plus 10% of the gross.
It's an astronomical figure.
Let's contextualize that for you listening. $5,000 a week in 1935, during the height of the Great Depression, is a staggering almost incomprehensible sum of money.
Right.
And adding 10% of the gross revenue meant Zanuck was effectively a partner, not just an employee. But for that unprecedented compensation, Zanuck demanded unprecedented power over the product.
He fundamentally rewired the architecture of the studio. Zanuck operated 20th Century Fox like a ruthless, highly optimized industrial assembly line.
Yeah.
He did not cater to the artistic whims of individual directors, and he had absolutely no interest in the auteur theory. Under Zanuck, the script was the undeniable star.
Right.
He built a rigid, autonomous factory where writers wrote, directors directed, and he, as the ultimate authority, supervised every microscopic detail of the production process.
Let me introduce an analogy here because I really want to understand the strategic value of this approach. Zanuck treated filmmaking the way Henry Ford treated automobile manufacturing.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. He stripped the power away from the individual creators, the directors and the highly paid actors, to establish a mechanized, predictable production machine. The raw material was the script, and the final product was the film, and everything in between was standardized.
Exactly.
So did stripping power from individual creators actually create a stronger corporate shield during the economic devastation of the Great Depression?
Oh, it absolutely fortified the corporation. Think about it. When you rely on a temperamental star or an unpredictable director, you introduce massive financial volatility into your business model.
Right, because they are unpredictable.
Exactly. Stars demand exorbitant salaries, and directors go over budget pursuing some grand artistic vision. By establishing the script as the foundational asset, Zanuck standardized the manufacturing process of cinema. He fundamentally mitigated the studio's risk profile.
Because if the script is inherently strong, the moving parts become interchangeable.
Precisely the point. If a script was structurally sound, Zanuck didn't need to overpay for a marquee name. He could borrow stars from other studios or just plug in his own relatively inexpensive contract players, and the film would still perform at the box office.
That's brilliant.
It was. This assembly line efficiency generated reliable, predictable capital in a highly unstable macroeconomic environment. He built a system that did not rely on miracles. It relied on mechanics.
And that rigid, script-first assembly line generated a tremendous amount of capital. But Zanuck and the executive board didn't just hoard that capital, they weaponized it.
Yes, they did.
They poured it into aggressive technological investments. 20th Century Fox utilized technology not just to improve the art form, but as a deliberate moat to outmaneuver its competitors.
And we see this strategy deployed effectively very early on with the advent of synchronized sound. While Warner Bros. Was experimenting with a system called Vitaphone, William Fox had heavily invested in a competing technology called Movietone.
Explain the difference between those two systems, because the technological divergence is really what won Fox the war here. Vitaphone was a sound-on-disc system, correct?
Yes, exactly. Vitaphone relied on a photograph record playing on a turntable that was mechanically linked to the film projector.
That sounds incredibly fragile.
It was notoriously unreliable. If the film tore and had to be spliced, or if the needle even just skipped, the audio and the visual would fall completely out of sync.
Oh, wow.
It was a logistical nightmare for theater projectionists and often resulted in a ruined experience for the audience.
But Movietone was a sound-on-film system.
Right. Movietone was vastly superior engineering. It optically recorded the sound waves directly onto the physical strip of the film itself, right next to the image.
Okay.
Because the sound and the picture were physically bound together on the same piece of celluloid, they could never fall out of sync. If the film tore and a frame was lost, the corresponding audio was lost as well, maintaining perfect synchronization.
That's a massive advantage. And Fox proved the viability and the durability of this technology with the 1929 hit in Old Arizona.
Right.
This wasn't just another talkie, it was the first synchronized sound film to contain scenes shot outdoors. The Movietone equipment was robust enough to be taken out of the controlled environment of a soundstage and into the harsh conditions of a desert location shoot.
And that versatility signaled the absolute death knell for Vitaphone. Because of its reliability, its ease of use for projectionists, and its ability to shoot on location, the Movietone sound-on-film system rapidly became the industry standard.
Wow.
It instantly rendered Warner's massive investment in sound-on-disc completely obsolete and granted Fox a massive technological advantage in the marketplace.
So they successfully utilized technology to assert dominance in the 1920s, and they deployed that exact same strategy decades later when they faced an entirely new, potentially lethal existential threat.
Television. Yeah. The early 1950s represented a terrifying paradigm shift for the film industry. Following World War II, the American middle class migrated to the suburbs, and they began purchasing television sets in massive quantities.
They were staying home.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Theatrical attendance, which had actually peaked in the late 1940s, was devastatingly eroded. The studios were staring down a structural collapse of their audience base.
And Fox's response to this crisis was the 1953 debut of CinemaScope with the biblical epic The Robe.
Right.
Let's break down the mechanics of CinemaScope for you listening, because this wasn't just making the screen a little bigger. This was a radical transformation of the visual medium.
It really was.
CinemaScope used an anamorphic lens to compress a massive, ultra-wide panoramic image onto standard 35mm film during shooting. Then, when it was projected in the theater, a corresponding lens stretched the image back out, creating a vast, immersive, widescreen experience.
It was an experience that a tiny, low-resolution black and white television set sitting in a suburban living room simply could not replicate. Zanuck understood that you couldn't compete with the convenience of television. You had to compete on scale. You had to offer an overwhelming sensory experience.
Yeah.
He was so confident in this strategy that he issued a sweeping corporate decree. From that point forward, all major 20th Century Fox films would be shot exclusively in CinemaScope.
And furthermore, they had the hard infrastructure to enforce this new technological standard across the entire industry.
That's the key.
Right, because in the 1940s, Fox owned roughly 600 theaters across the country. They maintained a massive, vertically integrated pipeline that went directly from the Century City studio lot directly to the consumer.
Yep.
So they could mandate the physical installation of CinemaScope lenses and wider screens in their own theaters, effectively forcing the rest of the industry to adopt their proprietary technological standard if they wanted their films to be shown in Fox's premium venues.
They leveraged their physical real estate to dictate the technological format of the entire medium. It was a brutal, highly effective use of vertical integration.
But let's analyze the long-term viability of that strategy. I look at CinemaScope not just as an artistic choice, but as a deliberate act of corporate warfare.
Sure.
It was an audiovisual nuclear deterrent designed specifically to make the television set look pathetic in comparison. But I have to ask, was this massive reliance on a technological gimmick a sign of long-term structural strength, or was it an early symptom of corporate panic?
Honestly, it was undeniably a symptom of panic, albeit a highly effective short-term defense mechanism.
Right.
The studio system, as Zanuck knew it, was fracturing. The federal government, through the Paramount decrees, was actively forcing the major studios to divest their theater chains.
Breaking the very vertical monopolies that allowed Fox to enforce the CinemaScope standard in the first place?
Exactly. So the moat was drying up. CinemaScope bought 20th Century Fox crucial time, and it generated significant revenue in the mid-1950s. But technological novelty inherently has a short half-life.
Because everyone eventually catches up.
Right. Once widescreen formats became the baseline industry norm, once every studio adopted similar anamorphic technologies like Panavision, the playing field leveled again. You couldn't just sell the width of the screen anymore. You had to sell what was actually on it.
And while technology bought them a reprieve, the ultimate survival of a corporation relied on its ability to manufacture unprecedented, earth-shattering cultural phenomenons.
Yes.
The financial victories that defined Fox's absolute peak are staggering to review. They represent a level of revenue generation that fundamentally altered the economics of Hollywood. Let's look at the raw numbers of their greatest triumphs.
Well, the modern era of the mega blockbuster for Fox really begins in earnest in 1965 with The Sound of Music.
Right.
And the financial impact of this single film cannot be overstated.
Right.
It generated an astonishing $80 million in domestic rental receipts during its initial run.
To put that in perspective for the listener, $80 million in 1965 is equivalent to well over $700 million today.
It's massive.
It became Hollywood's all-time biggest hit, completely dethroning Gone with the Wind. But more importantly, from a corporate perspective, The Sound of Music single-handedly saved the studio from a decade of incredibly poor returns and near bankruptcy.
Exactly. It proved to the executive board that a single massive hit, if calibrated perfectly to the cultural zeitgeist, could float an entire sprawling corporate infrastructure.
It subsidized the failures of dozens of other pictures.
It did. But the true paradigm shift, the event that rewrote the financial rules of the entire entertainment industry, occurred in 1977 with George Lucas's Star Wars.
Oh, absolutely. The economic leverage of Star Wars is almost unrepeatable. Let's look at the margins.
Let's do it.
It was produced for a relatively modest budget of roughly $13 million, and it yielded well over $200 million in its initial domestic theatrical run alone.
And that is just the box office.
Right.
The true financial revolution of Star Wars was the exploitation of ancillary markets. Merchandising, soundtrack sales, television licensing, and eventually home video.
It transformed a film from a 2-hour theatrical experience into a persistent, multi-tiered economic engine.
It did. And the impact on the 20th Century Fox Corporation as a whole was seismic. In June 1976, while Star Wars was still in a troubled production, Fox stock was sitting at a dismal low of $6 a share.
$6?
Yeah. Following the release and immediate cultural explosion of the film in 1977, that stock skyrocketed to almost $27 a share. It drove the corporation's overall gross revenues from $195 million to $301 million in a single fiscal year.
It fundamentally redefined the scale of success.
Yeah.
And the studio managed to repeat this pattern of absolute world-conquering box office dominance decades later with the massive epics directed by James Cameron.
They did.
Let's discuss the Cameron era because the risk profiles here are terrifying. Cameron's Titanic in 1997 was a massive financial risk.
Huge.
The budget spiraled out of control, eventually reaching $200 million, forcing Fox to co-finance the picture with Paramount just to mitigate the catastrophic risk of a total failure.
It was viewed by industry analysts at the time as an impending disaster, right? A bloated vanity project that would literally sink the studio.
Right.
Instead, Titanic completely defied conventional box office logic. It didn't just open well, it held the #1 box office position for an unprecedented 15 consecutive weeks.
Wow.
It grossed a record-breaking $1.8 billion globally.
It held the title of the highest-grossing film in human history for over a decade.
Okay.
And it was only dethroned in 2009 by another 20th Century Fox property, James Cameron's Avatar, which utilized groundbreaking 3D technology to pull in an astonishing $2.7 billion.
It's just staggering. And alongside these massive anomalous events, Fox leadership built a highly disciplined portfolio of era-defining intellectual property.
Right.
These franchises sustained the studio's cash flow between the giant Cameron and Lucas tentpoles. They launched the Alien franchise in 1979, creating a highly lucrative hybrid of science fiction and horror.
Yeah.
They launched the Die Hard series in 1988, redefining the modern action genre.
They released Home Alone in 1990, which remained the #1 film at the box office for months on end, despite having a relatively low budget.
Right.
And crucially, they launched the X-Men series in 2000, which helped ignite the modern superhero boom that would eventually come to dominate the entire century.
These properties represent the absolute perfection of the modern blockbuster strategy.
They really do.
They are high-concept, easily marketable, heavily franchised intellectual properties that can generate massive recurring revenue, not just in theaters, but across global home video markets, aggressive merchandising campaigns, and endless television syndication deals.
But, and this demands a deeper structural question about the psychology of corporate management. Does landing a massive anomaly like Star Wars or Avatar actually damage a corporation's long-term strategy?
How do you mean?
Well, does experiencing that level of profit create a dangerous addiction to the blockbuster? Like forcing the studio to abandon a stable, diversified slate of mid-budget films in order to obsessively chase unsustainable lightning strikes?
Oh, the historical financial data strongly indicates that it absolutely creates a dangerous systemic dependency.
It does.
Yes. When a corporation experiences the profit margins of a Star Wars or a Sound of Music, the expectations of the shareholders and the board of directors are permanently, irrevocably altered. They are no longer satisfied with a solid 10% return on a mid-budget thriller.
Right. They want the massive hit.
They demand exponential growth. They demand that unprecedented level of return quarter after quarter.
And the management is forced to deliver it or they get fired.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Consequently, the studio begins allocating disproportionate amounts of its working capital to massive, high-risk projects. They place larger and larger bets on fewer and fewer films.
And they neglect the middle.
Entirely. They neglect the mid-budget, reliable films that traditionally provided a stable revenue floor during lean years. It creates an environment of extreme volatility, where a single failure can threaten the solvency of the entire corporation.
And this fierce addiction to massive budgets and unprecedented returns set the stage for the catastrophic financial volatility that would eventually break the studio apart from the inside.
Yes.
The warning signs of this bloat and boardroom chaos were flashing violently as early as the 1960s, We have to examine the disastrous production of Cleopatra, which finally ended principal photography in 1962.
Cleopatra is the ultimate cautionary tale of corporate mismanagement and unchecked hubris. It was originally budgeted at a highly manageable $5 million.
Okay.
It was designed to be a relatively straightforward historical epic, but it rapidly devolved into one of the most expensive and chaotic productions in human history.
Let's detail how a budget explodes from $5 million to $44 million. It was a cascade of catastrophic logistical failures.
Right.
The production began in England, but the cold weather continuously ruined the massive outdoor sets, and the star, Elizabeth Taylor, fell severely ill with pneumonia, requiring an emergency tracheotomy.
Just terrible.
Right. And the studio made the agonizingly expensive decision to scrap the English footage, shut down production, and completely relocate the entire shoot to Rome, Italy.
Relocating a production of that scale meant entirely rebuilding massive, intricate sets, including a replica of ancient Alexandria from scratch in Italy.
Wow.
Furthermore, the production was plagued by delays, script rewrites, and the highly public, scandalous affair between Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton.
Which created a media frenzy that the studio could not control.
Exactly. The budget ultimately settled at $44 million.
To place that number in a modern context for you listening, adjusted for inflation, that is equivalent to over $400 million today.
Unbelievable.
It remains one of the most exorbitant financial expenditures for a single film ever recorded.
And the financial hemorrhage was so severe, the daily cash burn was so intense, that it triggered the first major cannibalization of the studio's physical assets. To keep the corporation solvent while Cleopatra was draining the accounts, Fox president Spyro Scaris was forced into a devastating corner. He had to sell off 176 acres of the historic Pico Avenue backlot.
He sold the land to developer William Zeckendorf and the Aluminum Company of America for roughly $40 million.
Right.
That massive tract of land where countless classic films had been shot was bulldozed and developed into the commercial real estate district known today as Century City.
It is a stunning, undeniable visual representation of corporate decay.
Yeah.
The leadership was literally selling the ground beneath their own feet to pay for the escalating costs of a single bloated production. They were sacrificing the long-term infrastructure of the studio for short-term liquidity.
And the tragedy is that they did not learn their lesson from Cleopatra. Following the massive, anomalous success of The Sound of Music in 1965, the executive team, led by the Zanucks, doubled down entirely on massive musical epics.
They were desperately attempting to replicate that specific anomaly.
Right. The result was a devastating late 60s collapse.
They released a string of bloated mega-flops. They funded 1967's Dr. Dolittle, a massive production plagued by animal wrangling issues and terrible weather, which brought in only $6 million in domestic rentos against a massive budget.
Ow.
They followed it with a Gertrude Lawrence biopic titled Star in 1968, which yielded a pathetic $4 million. And then they released the wildly ambitious, logistically complex World War II epic Tora in 1970, which also failed to recoup its massive costs.
The cumulative effect of these consecutive high-profile failures was absolutely devastating to the balance sheet. By the 1969 to 1970 fiscal period, 20th Century Fox posted net losses of just over $100 million.
A loss of that magnitude triggered a vicious boardroom civil war. It forced the ouster of Richard Zanuck, who was running production, and eventually led to the removal of his father, the legendary Darryl F. Zanuck himself, from power.
Wow.
The internal chaos left the corporation structurally weak, entirely drained of cash reserves, and highly vulnerable to predatory acquisitions.
Which leads directly to the carousel of owners and the intense instability of the 1980s. This era is a textbook case study in corporate vulnerability and the ruthless mechanics of Wall Street.
Absolutely.
In 1981, an oil magnate named Marvin Davis and a highly controversial commodities broker named Mark Rich executed a $722 million leveraged buyout of 20th Century Fox.
We need to pause and explain the mechanics of a leveraged buyout, or an LBO, because it fundamentally alters the financial health of the target company.
Right, let's break it down.
In a traditional acquisition, the buyer uses their own cash or issues stock to purchase the company.
Uh-huh.
In a leveraged buyout, the buyer uses a massive amount of borrowed money debt to acquire the company, and they use the assets of the company they are buying as the collateral for that debt.
Wait, so the company essentially pays for its own acquisition.
Exactly.
Let's look at the math on the Marvin Davis deal. It was a $722 million purchase, But Davis only put up $55 million of his own liquid capital.
Why?
He financed the rest. He burdened 20th Century Fox with $650 million in fresh debt to execute the acquisition.
And that is the lethal flaw of an LBO. The studio was immediately choked by the massive interest payments required to service that $650 million in debt.
Right.
A film studio which relies on the unpredictable cyclical revenue of box office returns suddenly had massive, inflexible, fixed debt obligations every single month. The pressure on cash flow was immense.
And the situation rapidly deteriorated from bad to catastrophic when Mark Rich, the commodities broker who owned 50% of the company alongside Davis, was indicted by the federal government.
This wasn't a minor infraction. It was a massive historic indictment for tax evasion and illegal oil trades with Iran during the hostage crisis.
Right. Rich fled the jurisdiction and relocated to Switzerland, becoming an international fugitive. This public relations nightmare forced Marvin Davis to hastily buy out Rich's share of the studio for $116 million, just to sever the legal and reputational ties.
And finding the film business far too volatile, and crushed by the debt load he had placed on the company, Davis began actively selling off the studio's assets.
By piece.
Yeah. He sold the bottling companies, he sold the Australian theater chains, and he even sold a portion of the remaining physical studio lot. He was dismantling the company.
Right.
Eventually, he sold the entire remaining operation to Rupert Murdoch in 1985 for a total of $575 million.
If you look at the operational strategy of 20th Century Fox in this era, the corporation closely resembles a desperate gambler at a roulette table.
That's a good analogy.
Right. The leadership is actively selling off the furniture, the hard assets, the real estate, the diversified subsidiaries, just to fund one more spin on a bloated epic, desperately hoping for another Sound of Music or Star Wars to magically clear the ledger and erase the debt.
They were asset stripping their own infrastructure to service debt and fund high-risk production slates. It was fundamentally unsustainable. Under the ownership of Rupert Murdoch, the company did survive, and they fiercely diversified into television. Murdoch launched the Fox Broadcasting Network in 1986, which broke the stranglehold of the Big Three networks and fundamentally altered American media.
But despite the success of the television network and the continued profitability of franchises like X-Men and Avatar, the 21st century brought an existential threat that no single blockbuster, no matter how large, could defeat.
No.
The media landscape was shifting under their feet. We must analyze the digital siege and the failed pivot that doomed the studio. We have to look at the rapidly shifting consumer behavior that aggressively eroded Fox's traditional, highly lucrative cable, satellite, and theatrical models.
The streaming revolution, pioneered by companies in Silicon Valley, fundamentally decoupled the distribution of media from the traditional physical infrastructure.
Right.
Tech-driven giants like Netflix, Amazon, YouTube, and Apple entered the entertainment space not as traditional studios, but as massive, globally scaled platform ecosystems.
And their business model was completely alien to Hollywood. Traditional studios relied on the theatrical box office window, followed by home video sales, and subsidized by incredibly lucrative cable bundle affiliate fees.
Exactly.
The tech companies didn't care about box office. They relied on direct-to-consumer monthly subscriptions. And crucially, their aggressive expansion into content creation was subsidized by their massive technology market caps.
They could afford to lose billions of dollars on content to acquire users.
Right, because their stock price was tied to user growth, not box office profit.
And the market reality facing 20th Century Fox was stark and unforgiving. While 21st Century Fox, the parent company, was valued at a highly respectable $37.4 billion, these emerging tech giants held market values hovering around $1 to $3 trillion.
Wow.
The scale mismatch was absolute. Fox was bringing a knife to a nuclear conflict.
Furthermore, the core foundation of their business, the theatrical exhibition model, was visibly decaying. The data was undeniable. The 2019 U.S. box office dropped 4.4% year over year. Consumers were aggressively abandoning the expensive, inconvenient multiplex for the cheap, infinite convenience of high-speed streaming in their living rooms.
Rupert Murdoch and the Fox leadership clearly recognized this existential threat. They understood the brutal math. They knew that to survive in a digitized, direct-to-consumer landscape dominated by trillion-dollar tech behemoths, they needed massive, unprecedented scale.
They needed an overwhelming library of content to launch their own viable streaming platform.
Exactly. So in 2014, Fox launched a desperate, highly aggressive $80 billion acquisition bid for Time Warner.
They attempted to swallow Warner Bros. To double their size.
Yes.
But the market reaction to this bid was swift and brutal. Institutional investors balked at the sheer scale of the debt that Fox would have to take on to execute an $80 billion hostile takeover.
The market reacted negatively, triggering a sharp, painful drop in Fox's own share price.
The mounting debt concerns and the aggressive resistance from Time Warner's board forced Fox into a humiliating public retreat. They abandoned the bid entirely.
But the damage was done.
Right.
The failed maneuver left the corporation highly vulnerable, explicitly exposing the fact that they lacked the sheer financial mass to control their own destiny in the coming streaming wars.
This raises a critical structural question. Why couldn't a studio that successfully survived the Great Depression, the advent of television, and the VHS revolution adapt to the internet? Was it a failure of executive imagination, or simply a lack of the sheer capital required to wage a protracted multi-front war against Silicon Valley?
Honestly, it was primarily a massive deficit of capital and structural agility. Adapting to the streaming era required a traditional media company to willingly cannibalize its own highly profitable legacy businesses.
Right.
You had to destroy your own cable affiliate fees and shatter your own exclusive theatrical windows in order to build a digital streaming platform that would inevitably operate at a massive multi-billion-dollar loss for years before turning a profit.
You have to burn your own boats.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sox, as a standalone entity valued at roughly $37 billion, simply did not have the market capitalization required to absorb those sustained multi-year losses while simultaneously fending off incredibly well-funded attacks from Netflix, Amazon, and Apple.
They just couldn't afford the fight.
Right. They actually had the strategic imagination to see the threat, which is precisely why they attempted the massive bid for Warner Bros. But they fundamentally lacked the capital ammunition to execute the defense.
So, recognizing they lacked the capital to survive the impending digital bloodbath, Fox's leadership made a cold, calculated, and ultimately fatal decision. They decided to sell the empire for parts before its value was completely destroyed by the tech giants.
Yes.
This leads directly to the mega merger and Disney's $71.3 billion devourment of 20th Century Fox. Let's detail the absolute mechanics of this historic, industry-shattering transaction.
Well, the definitive merger agreement was a complex, drawn-out process. It was initially struck in December 2017. However, it had to be heavily amended in June 2018 after Comcast, the cable giant, attempted to disrupt the deal with a massive hostile counterbid.
Right.
Disney had to increase their offer significantly to fend off Comcast. The deal was finally officially closed in March 2019.
Let's look at exactly what changed hands. The Walt Disney Company acquired 21st Century Fox's legendary film and television studios, the highly acclaimed FX networks, National Geographic, the massive Star India satellite network, and crucially, a 30% equity stake in the streaming platform Hulu.
Yep.
The final purchase price was an astronomical $71.3 billion. It was structured as a 50% cash and 50% stock transaction.
But the truly fascinating aspect of this mega merger is the ruthless clinical mathematics behind the financial synergies. To a casual observer, paying $71.3 billion seems like an overpayment. Disney paid a massive 21% premium over Fox's stock price to acquire the company, and they issued 324 million new shares of Disney stock to compensate the Fox shareholders.
But the value unlocked for Disney was found in the debt and tax structures, correct? Let's break down these numbers for the listener because this is where the real corporate magic happens. Why did Disney's specific financial structure make this deal so lucrative for them, despite the high purchase price?
It all comes down to the cost of capital. Disney was acquiring a company, Fox, that operated with a 35% corporate tax rate and a 4% cost of debt, meaning when Fox borrowed money to finance a film, they paid 4% interest.
Okay, so Fox is paying high taxes and high interest.
Right. But Disney possessed a much larger, leaner, and more highly optimized corporate infrastructure. Disney boasted a 21% tax rate and a significantly lower 2.5% cost of debt. Yeah, so by absorbing Fox's assets and revenue streams into Disney's superior financial architecture,
Yeah.
Disney instantly made those same assets significantly more profitable.
Because they were paying less tax on the same dollar of profit and paying less interest on the debt required to fund the operations.
Exactly. The math is brutal, but brilliant. By combining the operations and applying Disney's lower tax and debt rates, Disney's financial modelers projected they would achieve a staggering $2 billion in operational cost synergies by the year 2021.
Just massive savings.
They were wringing massive profits simply out of the financial restructuring.
But beyond the financial engineering, the strategic rationale for Bob Iger, Disney's CEO, was singular and incredibly aggressive. The entire acquisition was predicated on one goal: the launch of their proprietary streaming service, Disney Plus Gale.
Yes.
Iger knew that to wage a credible, sustained war against Netflix, Disney needed overwhelming, undeniable content scale.
And by acquiring 20th Century Fox, Disney captured a massive, culturally vital library of intellectual property. They acquired The Simpsons, which provided hundreds of hours of highly rewatchable content.
Essential for streaming.
Right. They acquired the Avatar franchise, the highest-grossing property on Earth.
Huh.
And crucially, they acquired the film rights to Marvel characters like the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and Deadpool.
Which is huge for them.
Huge.
Yeah.
This allowed Disney to finally repatriate those characters and unify the incredibly lucrative Marvel Cinematic Universe under one corporate roof.
Furthermore, by acquiring Fox's 30% stake in the streaming platform Hulu, Disney combined it with their own existing 30% stake. This secured them a controlling 60% majority of Hulu.
Right.
It gave Disney a fully matured operational distribution pipeline for the adult-oriented R-rated content like Alien or Predator or Fargo that fundamentally wouldn't fit on the family-friendly, heavily sanitized Disney Plus platform.
But if we analyze the cold mechanics of this merger, it closely resembles a corporate strip mining operation.
Yeah.
Disney didn't want the legacy, the rich history, or the unique creative culture of 20th Century Fox. They had no interest in operating a parallel independent studio. They simply wanted the intellectual property or buried underneath the studio to fuel their digital streaming algorithms.
They didn't buy a house to live in it. They bought the land to dig up the oil underneath, and they immediately bulldozed the house to get to it.
That is the defining, inescapable reality of modern media consolidation. Disney was not purchasing a functioning studio to operate it as a peer. They were acquiring a parts depot.
A parts depot?
Yes. They extracted the highly monetizable franchises, they absorbed the extensive back catalog of classic films, and they seized the strategic equity in Hulu. And then they systematically discarded the physical and administrative infrastructure that had generated that intellectual property in the first place.
And once the ink dried on that $71.3 billion check, the systematic dismantling of a century-old Hollywood institution began immediately.
It did.
Which brings us to the final reality of this investigation: the erasure of an empire and its reduction to dust. The immediate integration phase following the close of the merger in 2019 was defined by brutal, widespread corporate carnage.
The layoffs were massive and immediate. Up to 4,000 employees were terminated. And this was not just redundant administrative staff or human resources departments.
Right.
This sweeping cull included highly experienced senior executives across global distribution, theatrical marketing, physical production, and visual effects.
The institutional memory of the studio, the accumulated knowledge of how to market and distribute a 20th Century Fox film, was just vaporized in a matter of weeks.
The creative shutdown was equally swift and severe. Disney immediately closed down the Fox 2000 label.
Oh, man.
This is a highly acclaimed, highly profitable division that had recently produced major critical and commercial hits like Hidden Figures, The Hate You Give, and Life of Pi. It specialized in the exact type of mid-budget, adult-skewing dramas that Disney traditionally avoids.
Furthermore, Disney brutally culled Fox's development slate. Major, highly anticipated in-development projects were abruptly canceled.
Just shut down.
Yeah, the big-budget animated feature Mouse Guard, which was weeks away from production, was shut down. The Tom Hanks drama News of the World was dropped and sold off to Universal. Disney explicitly stated in investor calls that they would focus their newly acquired resources primarily on integrating Fox's massive franchises, like Avatar, into their alternating release schedules with their own Star Wars films.
Then came the erasure of the brand identity itself. In January 2020, 20th Century Fox was officially stripped of the Fox moniker.
Right.
The film division was rebranded to 20th Century Studios. The television division, which had produced some of the most iconic shows in history, was rebranded to simply 20th Television.
Now, Disney claimed this was a calculated move to avoid consumer confusion with Rupert Murdoch's remaining Fox Corporation, which retained the highly polarizing Fox News and Fox Sports networks.
Yeah.
But regardless of the stated intention, the result was the effective erasure of an 85-year-old brand identity from the global consciousness. The iconic searchlights remained, but the name that defined a century of cinema was just gone.
And the final, most deeply symbolic death knell was physical.
Yeah.
Disney officially announced that it will fully vacate the historic 50-acre Fox studio lot in Century City by the end of 2025.
Wow.
This is the very same physical space, the very same plot of land that the studio had occupied since William Fox built Century Park in 1928. The physical footprint of the empire, the sound stages where Shirley Temple danced and the xenomorph hunted is being entirely abandoned.
This forces us to ask a critical, deeply unsettling question regarding the true cultural cost of this relentless corporate efficiency. When a major studio that operated independently for 85 years, a studio with a distinct creative mandate that produced everything from John Ford's The Grapes of Wrath to Ridley Scott's Alien, is reduced to nothing more than a clickable content supply tab on a digital streaming app, do we lose a distinct, vital voice in global cinema? Or is this just the cold, natural, unavoidable life cycle of corporate capitalism?
Honestly, it is undeniably both. From a strictly economic perspective, analyzing the flow of capital and the threat of the tech platforms, it is the natural, inevitable consolidation of a mature industry facing massive technological disruption.
Because Fox lacked the scale to survive independently.
Exactly. But culturally, the loss is profound and irreversible. 20th Century Fox operated with a specific aggressive risk profile.
Yeah.
We're willing to produce R-rated adult thrillers, massive, unwieldy historical epics, and complex mid-budget dramas. That is a risk profile that a highly sanitized, digitally optimized, deeply risk-averse ecosystem like Disney fundamentally avoids. When you remove a buyer of that scale and that specific taste from the theatrical marketplace, the diversity of the stories being told inevitably shrinks. The ecosystem becomes a monoculture.
Which leaves you, the listener, with a chilling corporate reality to mull over as we conclude this investigation.
Indeed.
The rise and total fall of 20th Century Fox proves that in the modern entertainment era, studios in the traditional sense of the word simply no longer exist.
They don't.
They have been entirely replaced by intellectual property portfolios, a physical place where movies are made complete with sprawling backlots, a deeply rooted history, and a unique creative identity simply cannot compete against a vertically integrated trillion-dollar technology ecosystem.
The math just doesn't support it anymore.
The jagged white line on the financial X-ray is clear. The age of the independent Hollywood titan is dead, and the age of the digital content mill has taken its place. Thank you for joining us on this intense investigation. Keep examining the massive structures around you because, as we have seen today, even the most dominant giants eventually fall to dust.